Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the True Understanding podcast, where we dive deep with global workplace leaders to explore the strategies shaping the workplaces of tomorrow. I'm Rebecca Corliss of Verge Sense, and I am joined by my co-host, Omar Ramirez of Collective. And today we have a really fun conversation with Corinne Murray from Agate, where we dig into her passion of what she calls ways of working. And she talks about what they are, and more specifically, how your team can use them to support a culture in the new era of the flexible workplace. Well, Corinne, we're psyched to have you here. Thank you for joining us. We know we have a lot of conversation to go into ways of working. We know that's your whole world and you support a lot of companies on this topic. So really to start nice, high level and broad, can you talk to us about what ways of working are, in your words, define that for us, and why focus on ways of working is really important to the workplace world?
Sure. I think overall, prior to the pandemic, when we tie this to space, we assumed that just work was the thing that we did when we went to the office that we went to do it in. Through the course of the pandemic and, through a lot of other studies, especially around activity-based working, which was created in the Netherlands back in the 70s and 80s, there's a breakdown around what kind of environments do the best work in supporting certain activities. Through the pandemic, when space got stripped away from work that was still needing to get done, the world has started to pay a little bit more attention to what are all of these activities that people do in an average day, an average week, an average month that move the needle forward, or in some more unfortunate cases, actually create more bottlenecks and friction for productivity and effectiveness for organizations. So overall, it's the things that we've always done. It's meetings, it's collaboration, it's deep focus, it's the, meeting people to just catch up and have a quick chat. And we need to be more deliberate and more concise about how we plan and create space for those things now that we're in more distributed and more dynamic environments coming out of the pandemic.
Got it. So these are the ways of working. I'll use literally that we're used to all the time. But what you're doing is you're making it more of a set of principles, like bringing a bit more focus and thoughtfulness to it. So instead of it being kind of haphazard activities, they're really specific things that we want to learn and understand and optimize well. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. And yeah, there's a lot of stuff that I think, when we look at it, we realize just how much autopilot we put ourselves on. How many recurring meetings do we have on our calendars each week that we don't quite know what the purpose is for? How many?
Too many.
The answer universally for every single person is too many. So, all of these things that when you are able to zoom out and really ask the question, what is the value of this? What, does this move the needle forward on anything? Did any of my questions get answered? Or did anyone else's questions get answered for that matter? It's something that really needs to be looked at. And so my goal is really to help organizations be more specific about these things, because I think that there's a lot of untapped time that we can reclaim and let people think, let people be creative, and then ultimately help them innovate for new ideas, new ways of doing business for the sake of their organizations. So to me, this is like the perfect marriage of healthy employee experience, healthy company culture, and then also driving business forward. We are human beings. We like having a mission. Why not clear some of those blockers to make us really effective and awesome?
Yeah. And it sounds like you're talking a lot too, Corinne, about I know we talk about this a lot personally, is the idea that companies are should be setting these things intentionally, where you kind of used the word easy button before, and we were kind of on autopilot, right? Before the pandemic, because companies just had established ways of working and having to redesign them. Can you talk a little bit about that? How companies can, or I guess how can companies ensure that their culture is supported by their ways of working in an intentional way?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a give and take. The culture is supported by ways of working, and ways of working are also supported by the company's culture. How free are people managers with giving people the trust and autonomy to get the individual work done in the ways that each individual knows that they can do it most effectively. I say that with a big asterisk of organizations do need to come up with that framework that sort of creates, a clear enough swim lane for people. I think one thing that we're still wrestling with in our world right now is remote work is still identified as a very personal, very individualistic experience rather than one that is really tied together of we do these sets of activities asynchronously and apart. We do these sets of activities asynchronously but together. So are we all jamming in a Google Doc or on a Miro board, things like that? Or are we in person and collaborating in a workshop? Or are we, paired programming and just, Omar and I sitting near one another just so that way we could tap each other on the shoulder? So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I think that intentionality does convey to employees that they are more than just the workers, that they are actual people. And we want to enable what is most pragmatic for as many people as possible and really sort of extend the bell curve of how things can work for the most amount of people. And through that, people feel that value of we're not just, in a Taylorist cog in the wheel kind of format.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So what point in the process are ways of working defined? Like the intentionality is huge that you're talking about. It's not just a side effect. It's actually decided in advance. So who decides these? Are these the teams? Are these the managers? Is this part of a workplace or an employee experience team? How do these get formed and then chosen deliberately?
Yeah. I would say it's everything all of those all at once. The thing is, like we said in the beginning, these are things that we've done, in the modern age of working, long before any of us were in the workforce, even probably before our parents were in the workforce. So there's a lot of stuff that's just ingrained. And it's not I'm not necessarily out here to, completely flip the table and say, let's start from scratch. Let's just we first need to identify what activities are happening within each organization. Obviously, each company, VergeSense is going to have a different flavor of doing things than Purposeful Intent might, than LinkedIn might, that Genentech might, things like that. But the goal is to say, basically identify them and then evaluate them. Are they working? Are they working for what our purposes are? Are they helping us move things forward? So it's not necessarily let's throw things out and start from scratch. Let's make sure what we have suits us. And if it doesn't, let's figure out what things need to be augmented. So one thing in particular that is pretty ubiquitous and, we keep seeing a ton of data around, which I think is actually the easiest for the average person to sink their teeth into, is how much brain stress we experience when we have back-to-back-to-back meetings. Microsoft has issued, it was a small study, but it was pretty unilateral, the experience of having 4 back-to-back meetings without a break in between skewed the brain activity towards more stress on all the different subjects. And on the different subjects that had a few breaks in between those same 4 kinds of meetings, they stayed in a pretty balanced, low stress state. So that alone is a really, really interesting directional set of data that a company can make a decision around of, wow, if this is directional enough, if this is suggestive enough for us to say back-to-back meetings are really getting in the way of people's ability to come to a problem, come to a situation clear-minded and thoughtful and ready to sort of dig in, then the math obviously is not, very straight line, but you can sort of extrapolate the risk that it can bring to an organization's profitability, entire balance sheet, and just its ability to innovate and build and, retain clients or whatever business that they have. So that's something to me that sort of strikes at the core of what ways of working is about. So again, it's not to upend everything. It's to really just examine and improve our relationship with them.
Yeah, I think something you and I have talked about this before, but Corinne, the ways of working from the way we've discussed it seems like it takes different shapes at the different stages of a company, right? Like what you were saying, like a Verge Sense might interpret this differently than a LinkedIn, than a Genentech, or their ways of working might be somewhat different depending on what they're trying to execute on and what their business model is, et cetera. But I think, you and I were personally worked with a company as early as like, a 2-person startup trying their first ways of working document is their operating principles.
Yep.
And so that like was their first established like ways of working. They don't call it a ways of working document. They just call it their operating principles, but it's the way they action their business. And I think it's interesting to see companies doing it that early. But, I think imagine for Rebecca, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, this would probably be much more complex at Verge Sense, which is an established company and has entrenched ways of working that may or may not have been intentional, but have like grown over time. Does that make it more difficult?
Yeah, either grown more cultural or differentiated based off of the job to be done or the outcome we need or the style of the team. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, it can operate like scar tissue. Like it's there and it takes up space and it bridges whatever gap a company might be experiencing at any time. But you can zhuzh it, you can make it work a little better. And then to sort of carry the metaphor in a more thoughtful direction, I forget the name, but the Japanese practice of when a bowl or something breaks and then you sort of you can seam it back together with glue and the gold paint. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Does anyone know this?
I know exactly what you're talking about. I feel like we need a researcher now on this show. So someone
get
Google
the answer
searching
live.
Get someone in
so
here.
Anyway, like that practice of just because it broke doesn't mean that it's broken forever. There's a way to, again, like with that assessment, with that approach of continuous improvement, there's a way to sort of evolve out of brokenness into awareness. I sound like a therapist, but anyway, I think that there's a lot of opportunity in just figuring out what are those things that create. Ultimately, we're trying to fix frictions, and the frictions, these frictions existed pre-pandemic. They've just become more glaringly obvious as we've gone through 3 years of very wildly tumultuous change that won't stop for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, Corinne, I'd love to dig into your process. So
Please.
We started the conversation. We talked a little bit about what ways of working are. It sounds like when you work with a company, you start with auditing those, understanding them, likely knowing their intention. You talked a little bit about, what did you call it? Brain pain? I made it rhyme, but I can't remember what you said. I'm going to call it brain pain, but you called it what?
Let's go with
Brain
that,
stress?
I can't remember.
Newly coined
like
brain pain or other friction, etc. So you're auditing those. So I guess talk a little bit more about what you look for when auditing someone's ways of working, or I should say a company's ways of working, in order to identify opportunities to improve, to make a company more impactful. What do you look for to know if there's opportunity to shift?
Yeah, I would say I always look for the low-hanging fruit. And I mean that in the sense of the low-hanging fruit is the stuff that people can verbalize and say, this gets in my way. Or they might not be able to say it by, like, they might not have the words for it. But if I were to say, do you have just for an example, like, do you have too many meetings that you don't get to do your focus work until 6 p.m. at night? And then if I get like a resounding, like, oh my God, yeah, it happens on a weekly basis or monthly basis, like, to me, that's the thing that will be the easiest for people to coalesce around. And through my years of experience of doing, sometimes harebrained and, more progressive stuff than I think a lot of people are ready to recognize, that's been a skill that I've needed to internalize, of fix the problems that people can feel rather than the ones that they can't feel yet. Because they're not going to be able to wrap their heads around or appreciate the transformation to something that they're not yet quite able to diagnose. So I go with the low hanging fruit because that's something that everyone can coalesce around. So let's, to continue with let's fix our relationship with meetings and meeting culture. I would go in, verify that that's actually something that they have pain around, but I would find that thing, identify ways that they can start to peel them away, ways that they can start to use other practices to replace meetings. You know, we all are very familiar with the meme of this meeting could have been an email. You know, I think that there are other
meme
more
worthy now.
Oh, I mean, if you spend enough time on LinkedIn, I think yes. But I think, you know, there are a lot of other asynchronous ways to mitigate the requirement for so many meetings. So whether it's, you know, products like Notion or working via Slack or, you know, having a universal understanding of when we use Google Docs, when we do this, when we do that, there's a way to sort of like siphon the attention or the demand for meetings in other directions, basically helping to figure out how do we redirect attention into things that can happen asynchronously and don't create these major punctuations in everyone's days consistently.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. And then maybe last question on this particular topic, and then we can navigate in talking a little bit about how companies can start to employ this process and really start thinking about this. Perhaps as a shortcut, but I'm very curious to know, you talked about meetings, or I guess I'll say the meeting is default as an often failed way of working, or often, I don't want to say always, but often failed way of working.
I would say everything in moderation, it's just way overused.
Way overused. That by default is likely the flaw
Exactly.
in that.
The too many.
What are the too many? What are some other ways of working that through your analysis and through your time with companies you see, I'll say, failing frequently that might give companies a leg up and maybe identifying these ways of working to really question like, maybe this might not be a fit for us, or at least we should bring intentionality to that. So I'm curious what you've seen.
Yeah. I think linking back to what Omar was saying about his friend who it has all these, you know, one-on-ones or just, you know, virtual or in-person conversations, but then doing the heads down work at night. I think that's more symptomatic across, especially the U.S. base of workers than I think we really have a handle on yet. I think that's a little bit of a scary norm that a lot of us experience, and you know, there's more science around like burnout. If you're working more than 45 or 50, 45, I think is the breaking point number of if you are consistently working more than 45 or 50 hours per week, you're on your way to sending yourself into burnout. And since that's pretty much been the norm for most people for about the past 3 years, let alone anyone who is not living alone and has parents that they might be caring for or children they might be caring for. We have a really, really major burnout crisis that has yet to really be addressed. So I would say that's another piece that organizations can and really should be paying a lot of attention to, because, you know, giving people mental health time off or, you know, closing the office from, you know, December 15th until January 1st, that's not going to cure burnout for your people. Those are just like, they're able to tread water for a few days and get, you know, maybe get back to some form of stasis, but it is a very teeny Band-Aid on a very systemic problem. And I think that that relationship between meetings and this and burnout, I think, are actually quite tied together. So, you know, there's a lot of conversation. I would say that burnout is framed in a more health and wellness and, you know, HR policy kind of way. But I think that there's a really strong case for it to be looked at through the lens of a COO or a CFO in terms of what are hours lost or what is value lost over time if we're continuing to subject our employees to untenable ways of working. You know, if you are recognizing that your people are online until X%, like, you know, X hour at night, or they're yielding X number of hours on their company device, then you need to obviously do some qualitative searching and ask, like, hey, are you using this device for personal things? We're not going to ask you anything further than that, but we're just trying to suss out, are you working this much? And if so, we need to, you know, this is something we need to come in and help help course correct. So I would say those are the two probably biggest things that need solving, and I think have a lot more teeth to it than it can sometimes look in the media. It can unfortunately look really lofty and soft and, touchy-feely, but at the end of the day, all of this stuff detracts from our ability as an economy to grow and, continue.
Well, and I think a lot of the time too, people like we said, meetings are low hanging fruit. They are the lowest hanging fruit, but they're also extremely complicated when you start to dig into the details of how meetings develop, how they form, people's beliefs around meetings, even where you're like, oh, well, I think meetings are important because I was trained in an in-person environment where going to a meeting was important and getting to go to a meeting with my manager was important and value was put into that. So we have this assigned value to it. So those little things can seem easy, but then they become very complicated when you start to dig in.
Oh, 100%.
And I think that, when we look at this as like a holistic perspective, Corinne, I think a question that we have for you is who are the companies and who are the teams that you're seeing with ways of working that are doing this well? Who is taking a hard look at this and who's doing a good job at considering it, implementing it, and adjusting it based on, our new reality of 2020 going into 2023. Jeez.
I know. How are we at 2023? Yeah. I would say the companies that are tackling this head on, and I think the way that's really appropriate for the moment are a lot of the remote first companies. So I'll always give Darren Murph and GitLab a shout out because I think that they have been, they've had their remote playbook out and in the universe for years, even predating the pandemic. And I think that they are understanding that all these modalities play together and there does need to be a lot of intentionality around it. And I think a lot of the other companies that have adopted remote first or entirely remote practices are being the most disciplined around it right now. Do they have it figured out? No chance in hell, because we're still in the very, very early incubation phases of this. But I think because they have embraced the idea that space and workplaces are an asset, not the container, is a really, really important differentiation that a lot of hybrid and office first organizations have yet to really accept. So I think Dropbox experimenting in this space is really interesting. I would say Spotify hasn't shared a ton, but I'm really, really curious about how their work from anywhere is going. Same with Airbnb. These companies that have stripped away space, at least for the time being and in a permanent way, they're still getting together and doing their team offsites and things like that. I would say that they are the current front runners on those who are figuring it out. I think that it's only a matter of time until there's a bigger cohort of early to middle range adopters that we'll start to see through 2023 and 2024. And probably around 2025 is when we'll start to see some benchmarking and standards really start to land in a way that the more conservative organizations, likely a lot of the publicly traded companies, will start to adopt once there is I would say a broader set, proof of concept.
When I hear you talking about this, I think there's a lot actually that remote companies, and you tell me if you disagree with this, but I think there's a lot of these companies who are disjointing work in place, the remote companies, can teach companies who are doing hybrid or office first because they're focusing on the ways of working and culture without having the silo of the physical space. So I think they're doing a lot of work on that. And we can learn from hybrid and in-office teams can learn from those teams the same way that I think teams who are doing a really good job at gathering and doing the in-person version of hybrid can teach those remote teams how to gather well and how to do experience really well. And I think about Salesforce's Ranch concept and things of that nature where remote teams can learn about a lot about that because the reality of remote teams is everyone's going to come together eventually in an offsite. And that's going to be that's a way of working, right? Gathering.
Yeah.
So I think that's an interesting thing to me is how can we all learn from each other and we're all doing
100.
different specialized things.
Yeah, I would even extend that the gathering piece to the cohort of organizations that still lean a lot on in person and hybrid, because there still is this false equivalency, whether it is deliberate or not, that just being physically together is gathering, which anyone who has done event design, experience design, community design, any of that kind of stuff knows that this is not a field of dreams formula. Just because it's there doesn't mean that it's going to, it'll come to life and it'll be the thing that you hope it is. So I absolutely love that point. And I think there's a ton that still is needed to be learned across the board.
So, I mean, it comes back to that awesome quote. I mean, it's worth repeating. You said workspace is an asset, not a container. And my goodness, I'd get that on a bumper sticker. That's such a lovely phrase. And I wanted to use that thought and really bring in different questions. So a lot of our listeners are thinking about designing spaces, evolving their spaces. I think bringing this type of intentionality is going to be really important, and ideally how it enhances or allows for different ways of working. So can you talk to us about some of the workplace decisions you're seeing when people are thinking of it truly as an asset to enhance our ways of working? What are some of the workplace decisions you're seeing made that are really impactful and moving the needle to helping ways of working be really impactful? Yeah,
it's interesting because I think a lot of folks in our world would agree that 2022 was a bit of a slower year in terms of design evolution than we were expecting. And I think that it is attributed to a couple of different things. One, Omicron really did a number on us this year, as we all know. But the implications of that from a real estate and a workplace perspective is that there was never a long enough period of time to demonstrate what a quote unquote post-COVID normal occupancy or like behavioral pattern could look like. And so real estate teams really were sitting on their hands because they just didn't know. They didn't have enough data that made them feel confident to say, this is the direction we should be going in, even if, this is what we can iterate and change around. And also economic headwinds. We've seen tech really need to be restructured through the latter half of this year. So there's been a lot of choppiness surrounding these decisions that have, I think, stunted the evolution. But so I'll preface that with one of the things that I found the most interesting through 2022 is Caroline Quick at Cloudflare, head of real estate and workplace there. They have a very clear understanding with their employees that, they're incubating, they're experimenting. And one of the things that they were testing out was around workplace tech. And the central point for them was around meeting tech. So they're not going to spend thousands and thousands of dollars on these really kitted out, really expensive meeting and conference tools when it actually is a more equitable experience if everyone's sitting on Zoom or Teams or whatever, and everyone is the talking head that they are. Mm-hmm. It's better than, like, if I were remote Zooming into a meeting room, it's a rough experience sometimes if I can't even see the face of the person who is in the back corner and I can barely catch what they're saying. I know folks that are hard of hearing, and so when they're on Zoom meetings and they have those talking heads, they can actually read lips if they can't actually catch the words. So there's, again, back to that, there's always going to be a way to design in a DEI-minded approach to things. And again, Caroline, I think, was very clear in saying this is just, they're experimenting. They don't want to invest in something that they're not quite sure of yet. Yeah. So, but that was an interesting one that I always really liked because it's a stopgap. And I think that's how a lot of teams need to be pivoting their thinking around transforming the workplace. Yep. We're not going to have answers probably until, might be early I don't even think we're going to get it anywhere until like 2027, 2028 in terms of really having
that long. Really?
Yeah.
I'm a little more optimistic than that.
We debate we debate this often.
For dust to settle and for us to say, okay, this, like, we've now sort of reached the next plateau. We're going to need to churn a couple of different times and have things break a couple of times.
Yeah.
But we can break things in an upward direction.
Yeah.
And so the meeting conference stuff is one piece. Sarah Anderson at Genentech. What I really love about the way that she and her team have framed it is they have these blanket agreements with their employees that have just said, you're opting into our workplace experience, one of which that is completely under construction in more the metaphorical sense than the literal sense. And to say, in order for this to get better, we need your participation. We need your feedback. We need to hear what's working for you and what is not. We need to understand the goals of each of the different business lines so we can help you solve toward answering those problems. And it's created a culture of co-creation rather than decisions are coming down from on high and here you are, employees, here's the playground that we've given to you. We'll see you in 7 years.
Sure. And Corinne, I'd love just a little bit more, just a little bit. I think I hear you loud and clear. Sounds like 2022 was a little slow for, I'll call it definitive innovation.
Yeah.
I think a lot of innovation, but definitive innovation, obviously very challenging.
Yes.
And we heard about meeting tech being one of the workplace decisions. I'll say experiments that were run.
Experiment is a good way to say it.
You gave that great example. What are some of the other, I'll say, workplace experiments, workplace design experiments that are happening right now to impact ways of working that you think other companies might want to invest in or at least experiment with as well?
Yeah, I would say a lot of organizations have finally started to move towards, if they've had very outdated built environments, they have shifted toward a more activity-based design lens. So designing spaces that are dedicated to focus, designing spaces that are dedicated to lounge and gathering in any sort of formal or informal fashion. And then your typical meeting rooms, boardrooms, and things like that. It sounds pretty basic, but it actually is pretty staggering to know how few workplaces actually meet those kind of standards. So it has been nice to see some companies who have been a little behind the 8 ball on that for whatever reason, they just might be in vintage space or things like that, moving that needle forward in terms of just saying, we know that these are the basics. It's kind of like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs in terms of we all know at some point everyone needs to focus, everyone needs to collaborate and meet and all those kinds of things. And here are the physical assets we're providing to make that easier for you. So I would say that's the bottom of the foundation, figuring those key principles out.
Yeah. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, as you've talked about this, it just seems like at the end of the day, the ways of working that are most successful are intentional ways of working versus default or accidental or habitual, but not in service of the individuals, whatever it may be, whatever the cause may be. And it makes sense for a good foundational first step to be creating intentional spaces for intentional ways of working to make sure that that way of working can be done well wherever it may be at the asset, not the container, at the asset.
Exactly.
I think that's great.
Yeah. A lot of it is just common denominator thinking. What is the thing that's going to solve a ubiquitous problem? Obviously there are different use cases and different personas, but at the end of the day, human beings, which we all are, only can succeed with certain things when they're provided to us. So we need companies that focus on that really broad brushstroke first and then tapering in on the details rather than starting with really nascent detailed use cases and then trying to create a tapestry out of them, I think we'll have more success in this test bed moment that we're experiencing.
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge too, Corinne, on your timeline, you were talking about 2027. how long it takes to implement change like this sometimes. And I think people like think it's gonna be like, we did it, like we had a meeting, we talked about it, it was great, we did it, ship it. But like the example you were using from Cloudflare started working and redoing their ways of working in their physical space design in mid 2020.
Yeah.
So they're still working on it. Like at the end of 2022, they're still doing their thing. They're still reconsidering a lot of the design to this day, and that's good because they have a very progressive plan in place. But it does take time, and I think that a lot of people think of this as a set it and forget it kind of thing. We want to like hit the goal, accomplish it, and be done. But it is a very like long-term thinking kind of thing, and you need to slow down every so often and decide. I think that we talk about this a lot, but that cadence of how often are we going to reconsider these things, or how often are we going to take a look at these things is an important thing for companies to consider too. Is like, how often are you going to reassess this? Is it every 6 months? Is it every quarter? Is it every year?
Yeah.
And knowing that cadence is good.
And I think that ties into a lot of how I think about it, sort of tying back the workplace and all the other tools and offerings that companies give to their people. They're products. Actually, Darren had a LinkedIn post about how remote is a product, not an experience. And I think that it's a really important thing for organizations to adopt more of this product-minded thinking. Just to say, product teams that, run agile and understand all these different dynamics of you create something, you test it, you put it out in the world, you collect feedback, you internalize it, you augment, you edit, and then you move forward and you go through that life cycle. Organizations need to be thinking the same way for their employees. They need to continuously be taking in insight from their users. Employees are their customers. They're just not the ones that they pay. They're paid in different ways. So I think, Omar, what you're describing is that constant life cycle of test, deliver, examine, and just that continuous motion, because, and it's something that is a really big mental shift for the real estate and workplace world, because we are used to thinking in 7 to 10 year linear tranches of, we sign a lease, we design a space, we do the change management, and we move people in, people live and do their thing there for however many years, and then we rinse and repeat. That model only kind of sort of worked, and now it definitely doesn't work. And so there's a lot of, this isn't just about the workers changing, it's about the delivery mechanisms and the operating teams changing their methods as well. So it's just a walk in the park. It's going to be super easy.
Super easy. And what I love, what you did for us there is, in the event maybe a company is listening that wants to employ a methodology of auditing ways of working and figuring out what's best, it sounds like the first step that you would recommend is just making sure you have that cycle in place. You're getting that input, you're getting that feedback, you're listening, you're assessing, because that's going to be the necessary input at the very beginning to make any type of changes. And you just got to make sure your ears are open to begin.
Absolutely. Treat it like a product, and that framework is it's very easy to follow. There's complex work that's built into it, but the approach itself is very easy to understand.
Yeah, that's great. And then, Corinne, how about this for a last question? I want to end in a storytelling mode. I wonder if you can give us a great success story. Maybe tell us about a company, named or not, your choice, and tell us a story about this company and how maybe they assessed their ways of working, came to some sort of aha or learning, and made an improvement and a change that actually had a big impact. And tell us what that impact was.
I'll describe it. This is not from my experience with Agate, but more my experience at WeWork. And I would say that there are opposing opinions on the success or not, but I joined WeWork in early 2018. So we were like at the tippy top of all the, good vibes and that stuff. And we were growing at an insane rate, and the headquarters space that we had in Chelsea, New York was designed for 1,200 people. And on an average, there was about 1,600 people showing up at any given day.
Wow.
And at the same time, 45% of the desks were vacant at any given moment.
Huh.
And every single meeting room was booked, every phone booth was taken, and 45% of the desks were completely empty. So I was shifted from our external consulting team into a more internal, workplace strategy innovation role, and developed a very, very aggressive ratios that I literally will never, ever touch ever again version of activity-based working, because we needed to make this container make sense for 16 or 1,700 people when it actually was only intended for about 500 people less than that. So we really, the way that my research partner and I and the project executives did this was we came up with this math. We worked with, some designers to plot things out and make it make sense. And then we needed to build the business case around it to say, hey, leaders, we know that this is a soggy sandwich that you're not really going to want to eat, but here's the alternative, and the alternative is worse. And so we really created this whole stage, I'm blanking on I think we called it like the change room. And we just had posters that laid out the case of here's the problem, here's why it's a problem, here are the scenarios in which we could try to solve it, and here's the one that we selected and why. Here are the attributes, here are the detriments, and here's what it'll look like and what it means for your team. So we took all the leaders that were in Chelsea HQ through this whole process to say, we know this isn't ideal, but this is the best that we can do, and we're trying to do this in 6 months. And
wow.
Oh yeah, super easy.
Realistic timelines, realistic goals.
It was a great time. But what was so interesting about that was, it was very much like the stages of grief. Like everyone was in denial, like, no, we don't need to do this. Then they get angry. And then by the end, they would be at this place of understanding of this was the best we could do with the tools and resources that we had available to us. And for the most part, the buy-in was quite successful because we were able to just say, this is what we can do with our backs up against the wall, and here's what we need from you and your people to make it work as best as it can. In practice, things broke down because there was a lot of churn. There were a lot of really young managers, and so those were people who were never had been trained in how to not be a line of sight manager in a very dynamic activity-based working environment that really requires like a level of comfort with autonomy. So, there were things that if all things were held equal, we would have gone back in and done that iteration and fixing and product evolution. But it was definitely a very ambitious and very radical thing that we were able to get done. And I can comfortably say what the outer bounds are in terms of workplace density and experience density.
Mm-hmm. Now you have that experience.
Yeah.
And so
I literally would go in front of clients and say, I know exactly what not to do.
Got it. And so, I mean, would you call it a success? Did it have the impact you wanted, or did you just avoid what would have been a larger failure?
I would say both.
Okay.
It definitely mitigated things breaking. Like we definitely bought ourselves time from August of 2018 until about March of 2019. So that was a considerable amount of time that we bought ourselves, and it helped to grow the conversation around what true workplace strategy and workplace innovation was within the company itself. I think this was something within the co-working world that was co-working was the innovation, but people like me were able to really help the salespeople, help people in product and all that kind of stuff, really understand the people interaction with environments, and not just that, again, not that individualistic experience, but the organizational and sort of productivity and effectiveness relationship to space in a way that us just talking in theory wouldn't have moved the needle on.
Yeah. Yep, that makes a lot of sense. Well, Corinne, this has been fantastic. Love your stories, love your examples. I think it's really smart to make sure companies are bringing intention to ways of working as part of their workplace strategy, tangential or directly within it, whatever it may be. And love your energy too. I have to say it. You made this episode a lot of fun. So thank you so much. I can tell you and Omar are friends. It's good.
Yeah,
we haven't spent the larger power this year together.
Oh, it's great. So thank you for joining us.
It was a great time.
Absolutely.
Hey there, this is Omar Ramirez, co-host of the True Understanding podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave us a 5-star review to help us expand our reach and grow our community of workplace leaders. If you'd like to suggest a topic or guest, please drop us a line at trueunderstanding.vergesense.com. The True Understanding podcast is created by VergeSense. Over 130 global companies rely on VergeSense for a true understanding of how their workplaces are used, so they can continuously and confidently optimize spaces to reduce costs and improve employee experiences.